The text message arrived while I was overseeing the final touches for the Henderson-Mitchell wedding. I stared at my phone screen, the bright light illuminating my face in the dim corridor just off the main reception hall, reading and rereading, the words as though they might somehow rearrange themselves into something less alarming. We have a problem with the bride. Family intervention needed. Come to bridal suite ASAP. It was from Melissa, my assistant coordinator. My heart sank as I slipped my phone into the pocket of my tailored navy dress. Wedding day emergencies were part of the job, but they never got easier. After 6 years in the business, I'd handled everything from missing rings to fainting groomsmen to drunken relatives making inappropriate toasts. But family drama moments before the ceremony? Those were the landmines of wedding coordination. Took a deep breath and made my way through Hawthorne Manor's winding corridors. The 19th century estate, with its sprawling gardens and meticulously restored interior, had been my sanctuary ever since I purchased it 4 years ago. Few people knew I actually owned the venue. To most, including today's wedding party, I was simply Emma Lawson, the venue coordinator with a reputation for handling any crisis with unflappable calm. Only my closest friends and my inner management team knew the truth. That at 32, I'd invested every penny of my inheritance and savings into transforming this once-neglected historical property into one of the most sought-after wedding venues in the region. I kept my ownership private partly out of practicality. Difficult clients tended to behave better with the owner as a mysterious higher authority I could reference, and partly because I enjoyed the freedom it gave me to work directly with the couples without the weight of being the boss. The sounds of string quartet rehearsal floated down the hallway as I approached the bridal suite. Outside the heavy oak door, Melissa was waiting, her usual composed demeanor replaced with evident tension. "What's happening?" I asked quietly. "The groom's mother and sisters arrived early to help the bride," she said, making air quotes around the word help. "They've spent the last 20 minutes telling Allison that her dress is inappropriate. Her choice of flowers is tacky and that the venue—" Melissa hesitated. "What about the venue?" I prompted. "They said it's quaint, but obviously budget-conscious, and they're embarrassed about what Richard's business associates will think." I felt a familiar twinge of defensiveness. Hawthorne Manor was anything but budget-conscious. Couples waited over a year for available dates, and the cost reflected both the manor's historical significance and the impeccable service we provided. But I pushed the feeling aside. This wasn't about me. It was about a bride being bullied on what should be her happiest day. "Where is Richard during all this?" I asked, referring to the groom. "Getting ready with his groomsmen in the West Wing." Completely unaware, I nodded, straightening my shoulders. "Let's go." The scene inside the bridal suite was exactly as I'd feared. Henderson-Mitchell, a normally confident marketing executive who had been nothing but gracious during our months of planning, sat at the vintage vanity in her wedding gown, mascara streaking down her cheeks. Around her stood 3 women in coordinating, pastel dresses, Richard's mother and sisters, I presumed, who fell silent as we entered. "I'm sorry, who are you?" the oldest woman asked, her tone making it clear she viewed me as an intrusion. "I'm Emma Lawson, the venue coordinator," I said with a practiced smile. "I understand there might be some concerns I can address." "Unless you can address the fact that this venue is hardly suitable for a Henderson wedding, I doubt it," said one of the sisters, examining her manicure. "Mother was just explaining to Allison that had we been consulted, we would have suggested the Grand Summit Hotel. That's where all the Henderson weddings have been held. Until Richard decided to let his bride make all the decisions. The other," sister added with a thin smile in Allison's direction. "We're simply concerned about appearances," Mrs. Henderson said, her voice dripping with false sweetness. "The Henderson name carries certain expectations. This place is charming, I suppose, if you're going for that rustic look. But really, Allison dear, couldn't you have chosen somewhere more significant?" The woman's words hit me like a physical blow. Hawthorne Manor was my life's work, my passion, and my greatest achievement. I'd spent countless hours researching its history, supervising its restoration, and personally selecting every paint color, light fixture, and piece of furniture to honor its past while creating a space of timeless elegance. The rustic look this woman so casually dismissed had been featured in national wedding magazines. But my feelings weren't important right now. What mattered was the bride, who looked utterly defeated. "Mrs. Henderson," I said calmly. "I wonder if I might speak with you and your daughters in the adjacent sitting room for a moment. Melissa will help Allison with her makeup in the meantime." The Henderson women exchanged glances, but followed me into the connected room. Once the door closed behind us, I turned to face them. "Ladies, I understand your family has traditions, and that's wonderful. But today isn't about the Henderson family. It's about Richard and Allison beginning their life together." "Which will be a Henderson life," the mother interjected. "Richard is poised to take over his father's company next year. There are expectations." I took a measured breath. "With all due respect, Mrs. Henderson, those expectations shouldn't include making the bride cry on her wedding day. Allison selected this venue after visiting 15 others. She and Richard have spent months planning every detail. If you have concerns about the venue's prestige, I can assure you that Hawthorne Manor has hosted senators, CEOs, and yes, even families with generational wealth who found it more than satisfactory." "Well," said one sister, clearly not used to being spoken to so directly, "we're just looking out for the family image." "And I'm looking out for your son's wedding day," I replied, "which, in about 40 minutes, is going to be irreparably damaged if his bride is too upset to walk down the aisle. Is that the family image you're hoping to project?" The women had the grace to look slightly abashed, but Mrs. Henderson rallied quickly. "I suppose we're just disappointed not to have been more involved in the planning," she said. "Richard has always valued our input before. This independence is new and somewhat concerning. So that was it, fear of losing control over their son and brother. I'd seen it countless times, this particular brand of wedding anxiety that had nothing to do with centerpieces or venue choice and everything to do with family dynamics shifting before their eyes. "Mrs. Henderson," I said, softening my tone slightly, "I've worked with hundreds of couples. The most successful marriages I've witnessed are those where families offer support without conditions. Richard chose Allison. Now they're choosing their path together. Your blessing would mean everything to them." For a moment, I thought I might have reached her. But then her expression hardened. "You're very eloquent, Ms. Lawson, but you couldn't possibly understand the responsibilities that come with a family like ours. This venue, while adequate, simply doesn't reflect our standards. I'm sure in your position, working with all sorts of clients, that's difficult to comprehend." There it was, the casual condescension, the implication that as a mere venue coordinator, I couldn't possibly grasp the complexities of wealth and status. If she only knew that I owned not just this venue but 2 others in neighboring counties, and that my position involved managing a multi-million-dollar business. But I swallowed the retort that rose to my lips. 4 o'clock was approaching, guests were being seated in the garden, and a bride sat heartbroken in the next room. My job now was to salvage this wedding, not defend my business credentials. "I understand more than you might think, Mrs. Henderson," I said quietly. "And right now, I understand that there's a woman next door who loves your son and wants your approval. The ceremony begins in 30 minutes. How would you like to proceed?" The Henderson women exchanged glances, a silent communication passing between them. "We'll be civil, of course," Mrs. Henderson finally said. "We are, after all, Hendersons." I nodded, knowing it was the best I could hope for at the moment. As I turned to leave, Mrs. Henderson added, "Though I still maintain Richard could have chosen better, both in venue and, well." She left the sentence unfinished, but her meaning was crystal clear. I felt my jaw tighten as I opened the door to return to the bridal suite. Melissa had worked magic in my absence. Allison's makeup was repaired, and she was sipping water, looking more composed. "Everything's fine," I assured her with a smile I didn't entirely feel. "Just some pre-wedding jitters from the family." "They're very excited for you and Richard." The lie tasted bitter, but the relief on Allison's face made it worthwhile. As her bridesmaids filed in to help with final preparations, I stepped back into the hallway, checking my watch. 28 minutes until the ceremony, and I had a sinking feeling that the Henderson family drama was far from over. Before we continue, if you're watching this from somewhere outside the US, drop a comment letting me know which country you're tuning in from. And if this story hits close to home, make sure you're subscribed. Because next week I'm sharing another wedding industry story that changed my entire business model. I returned to the main hall, taking a moment to absorb the beauty of the space we'd created. Crystal chandeliers cast a warm glow over ivory silk draperies and meticulously arranged table settings. Fresh gardenias and roses adorned every surface, their subtle fragrance filling the air. The Henderson-Mitchell wedding had one of our most expensive packages, including custom chair covers, premium linens, and a champagne fountain that had been a particular request of the bride. "How bad is it?" asked Julian, my head of operations, approaching with his clipboard. Julian had been with me from the beginning, a former event planner who'd recognized the potential in Hawthorne Manor, even when it was still covered in decades of neglect and disrepair. "The mother of the groom just implied that both the venue and the bride are beneath the family's standards," I said quietly. "And I'm fairly certain she's not done making her feelings known." Julian grimaced. "Charming. Want me to accidentally spill something on her dress?" I laughed despite the tension. "Tempting, but no. Just keep an extra eye on things. I have a feeling we might need to run interference throughout the evening." "On it," he promised. "By the way, the quartet is ready, guests are being seated, and the officiant has arrived. Everything's on schedule." I nodded, grateful for Julian's efficiency. "I need to check on the groom. Make sure he's not getting the same helpful input from his family." I made my way to the West Wing where Richard and his groomsmen were getting ready. Unlike the emotional scene in the bridal suite, this room was filled with laughter and the clinking of whiskey glasses. Richard Henderson stood by the window, tall and classically handsome in his tailored tuxedo, looking every bit the successful businessman his mother had described. I knocked lightly on the open door. 15 minutes, gentlemen." Richard turned, with a broad smile. "Emma, is everything on track? How's Allison doing?" The genuine warmth in his voice when he mentioned his bride gave me hope. Perhaps he wasn't as susceptible to his family's influence as his mother believed. "She's beautiful," I assured him. "Just putting on the finishing touches, but I wanted to check if you'd spoken with your mother today." A flicker of concern crossed his face. Briefly, when they arrived. "Why? Did something happen?" I hesitated, weighing my options. Wedding vendors lived by an unspoken code. We shield the couple from drama whenever possible, especially on their wedding day. But in this case, staying silent might cause more harm than good. "Your mother and sisters visited Allison in the bridal suite," I said carefully. "They had some opinions about her choices." I kept my tone neutral, not wanting to create conflict, but needing him to be aware. Richard's expression darkened. "What kind of opinions?" "They expressed some disappointment about the venue," I said, deciding to focus on the criticism directed at me rather than the more hurtful comments about Allison herself. "Something about it not meeting the Henderson standards?" He ran a hand through his carefully styled hair, a gesture of frustration. "I was afraid of this. They've been pushing for the Grand Summit Hotel for months. It's where all the appropriate Henderson events are held." His use of air quotes around the word appropriate told me all I needed to know about his feelings on the matter. "Is Allison okay?" he asked, genuine concern in his voice. "She's fine now," I assured him. "But I thought you should know. in case there's any tension during the reception. Richard nodded grimly. Thank you for telling me. I'll speak with my mother after the ceremony. He paused, then added, Allison and I chose this place because it was special, unique, not some cookie-cutter hotel ballroom. I'm sorry if my family made you feel otherwise. That's not necessary, I said, touched by his apology. I just wanted to make sure you were prepared. I've been preparing for my mother's disapproval my entire life, he said with a wry smile. But today isn't about her. It's about Allison and me. I left him with his groomsmen, feeling slightly more optimistic. Richard at least seemed to recognize his family's behavior for what it was. As I passed the grand staircase that led down to the ceremony garden, I caught sight of Mr. Henderson Sr., a distinguished-looking man with silver hair and the same, confident bearing as his son, directing staff to rearrange chairs in the ceremony area. Excuse me, I said, approaching quickly. Is there a problem with the setup? He turned, measuring me with a cool glance. Are you with the venue? I was just explaining to this young man that the chairs need to be aligned perfectly. The current arrangement is haphazard. I looked at the rows of white chairs, each one positioned exactly where our measurements indicated, with precise spacing for optimal comfort and view of the altar. We'd spent hours on this layout, consulting with both Allison and our accessibility expert to ensure every guest had a clear sightline. I apologize if the arrangement seems inadequate, I said, maintaining my professional tone. But the layout was specifically designed according to the couple's wishes and our venue guidelines. Moving chairs now could disrupt the processional path and delay the ceremony. Mr. Henderson gave me a patronizing smile. I understand you have your procedures, but the Henderson name carries certain expectations of excellence. Surely you can make this small adjustment. There it was again, the Henderson name wielded like a weapon. I was beginning to understand exactly why Allison had been in tears. The ceremony begins in 8 minutes, I said firmly. Guests are already being seated. I'm afraid we cannot make changes at this time without causing significant disruption. I turned to the staff member who had been receiving Mr. Henderson's instructions. Please continue with your assigned duties. The young man looked relieved as he hurried off. Mr. Henderson, however, was clearly not accustomed to being contradicted. I don't think you understand who you're speaking to, he said, lowering his voice. The Hendersons have considerable influence in this region. One word from me could impact your venue's reputation. It took every ounce of professionalism I possessed not to inform him that I didn't just work at Hawthorne Manor. I owned it, along with 2 other successful venues and a catering company. That my reputation was built on years of impeccable service, attention to detail, and respect for every client regardless of their surname. That his threat was as empty as it was offensive. Instead, I smiled politely. I understand completely who I'm speaking to, Mr. Henderson. You're the father of a groom who selected this venue, approved this chair arrangement, and is about to begin one of the most important days of his life. I'm sure you want everything to proceed smoothly for him. Before he could respond, the string quartet began playing the prelude music, my signal that we were now just 5 minutes from the ceremony's start. If you'll excuse me, I need to ensure the processional is ready to begin. Your seat is in the front row, right side. I walked away before he could respond, my heart pounding with controlled anger. In the 6 years since I'd entered the wedding industry, I'd encountered plenty of difficult family members, but the Hendersons were quickly securing their place at the top of that list. Behind the ceremony area, Allison stood with her father and bridesmaids, looking radiant despite the earlier tears. Her gown, a sleek column of ivory silk with delicate beading at the neckline, complemented her slender frame perfectly, regardless of what her future mother-in-law thought. You look beautiful, I told her sincerely. She gave me a shaky smile. Thank you, Emma, and thank you for earlier, with Richard's family. Melissa told me you stood up for me. That's part of my job, I said, though we both knew most venue coordinators wouldn't have confronted a mother of the groom quite so directly. Well, it meant a lot to me, she said. I've been trying so hard to win them over for the past year. Sometimes I wonder if I ever will. Just focus on Richard today, I advised her. The rest will sort itself out. As the bridesmaids began their procession down the aisle, I caught sight of Mrs. Henderson in the front row, her expression pinched as she surveyed the assembled guests. Her husband joined her moments later, leaning in to whisper something that made her nod in apparent agreement. The music changed, signaling Allison's entrance, and all eyes turned to watch her graceful progress down the aisle on her father's arm. All eyes except Mrs. Henderson's. That is, who seemed more interested in critiquing the floral arrangements than watching her future daughter-in-law's approach. I remained at the back, as I always did during ceremonies, ready to handle any issues that might arise. From this vantage point, I could see Richard's face as he watched Allison walk toward him, the love and admiration evident in his expression, a stark contrast to his mother's cool assessment. Whatever his parents might think, Richard clearly adored his bride. As the officiant welcomed the guests and began the ceremony, I allowed myself to hope that perhaps the worst was behind us. The ceremony itself was lovely. Personal vows that brought tears to many eyes. A unity ritual involving sand from beaches special to both of them, and musical interludes that Allison had selected with care. Everything was perfect until the moment. The officiant said those fateful words, "If anyone can show just cause why this couple cannot lawfully be joined together in matrimony, let them speak now or forever hold their peace." It was a traditional line, one that rarely caused issues in real weddings despite what movies might suggest. But as the customary pause stretched into uncomfortable silence, I saw Mrs. Henderson shift slightly in her seat, her mouth opening as if to speak. My blood ran cold. Surely she wouldn't. Not even the Hendersons would be so callous as to object at their own son's wedding. For one heart-stopping moment, I thought I was about to witness my first genuine ceremony objection in 6 years of wedding coordination. Then Mr. Henderson placed a restraining hand on his wife's arm, whispering something urgent in her ear. Whatever he said must have been persuasive, because she pressed her lips together and remained silent. The moment passed. The officiant continued. But the damage was done. I had seen her intention clearly, and from the stunned expression on Allison's face as she glanced toward her new mother-in-law, so had the bride. As the ceremony concluded, and the newlyweds walked back up the aisle to applause, I couldn't help but wonder what fresh drama the reception would bring. Something told me the Henderson family was just getting started. The cocktail hour following the ceremony took place in Hawthorne Manor's East Garden, where string lights twinkled among ancient oak trees and champagne flowed from crystal fountains. I kept a careful distance from the Henderson family, observing from various vantage points while directing my staff with subtle hand signals. So far, things seemed calm. Mrs. Henderson holding court among friends, Mr. Henderson discussing business with colleagues, and the Henderson sisters taking selfies by the reflection pool. "Emma," Melissa appeared at my side, her voice low. "The photographer wants to know if we should proceed with family photos now or wait until after the cocktail hour as originally planned." I checked my watch. We were running about 10 minutes. Behind schedule, not unusual for weddings, but enough to require some adjustments. "Let's start now," I decided. "Have them begin with the bride's family first, then the groom's. Make sure the bar is fully stocked before the Henderson family is called away. We don't want anyone getting restless." Melissa nodded and hurried off. I continued my rounds, stopping to chat briefly with guests, ensuring the catering staff was circulating properly with hors d'oeuvres, and checking that the band was set up for the reception. Everything was running smoothly, almost suspiciously so, given the earlier drama. "There you are." Julian appeared beside me, a flute of sparkling water in his hand. "The chef wants to confirm we're still on the original dinner timeline." "We're running about 10 minutes behind," I told him. But we should be able to make that up during the transition to the reception. How's the temperature in the main hall? Perfect. I had them adjust the air conditioning after the ceremony. Warm enough for the older guests, cool enough for dancing. Later, I smiled gratefully. What would I do without you? Probably work yourself into an early grave, he replied cheerfully. Speaking of which, you should eat something. I haven't seen you take a single bite all day. I will as soon as... My response was cut short by raised voices coming from the photography area we'd set up near the rose garden. I exchanged a quick glance with Julian before heading in that direction, moving quickly but not running, creating... A scene would only make things worse. The tableau that greeted me made my heart sink. The photographer, a talented professional named Carlos who had worked with us many times, stood with a pained expression as Mrs. Henderson berated him. Allison and Richard watched helplessly from the side, the bride's face flushed with embarrassment. Completely unacceptable, Mrs. Henderson was saying as I approached. These pose suggestions are pedestrian at best. The Hendersons have been photographed by Vogue contributors, and you expect us to do these generic wedding stances? Mother, please, Richard interjected. Carlos is excellent. We chose him specifically for his artistic style. That may be, Mrs. Henderson replied, not bothering to lower her voice despite the nearby guests who were now watching with undisguised interest. But he clearly doesn't understand the gravity of photographing our family. These will be historical documents, not just vacation snapshots. I stepped smoothly into the conversation. Mrs. Henderson, is there something I can help with? She turned her imperious gaze on me. Yes, you can arrange for a photographer who understands the significance of the Henderson legacy. This gentleman suggested we pose by that dilapidated garden wall. Dilapidated, for Henderson family portraits. I glanced at the dilapidated wall in question, a weathered stone structure deliberately preserved during our restoration for its historical significance and romantic appeal. It was, in fact, one of our most requested photography backgrounds, its patina creating a timeless quality that highlighted the subjects rather than competing with them. Carlos is one of the most sought-after wedding photographers in the region, I said calmly. The vintage wall creates a beautiful contrast with formal attire and has been featured in several magazine spreads. However, if you prefer a different backdrop, we have many options. The wall is beautiful, Mother, Richard said firmly. Allison and I selected it specifically. Mrs. Henderson's eyes narrowed. I see I'm outnumbered. Fine, but I want to review each pose before it's taken. The Henderson family has certain standards to maintain. I caught Allison's eye and gave her a subtle nod of encouragement. The poor woman looked like she was calculating the costs of elopement, even at this late stage. I'll leave you in Carlos's capable hands, I said. He's photographed several notable families here, including the Ashfords last summer. I dropped the name deliberately, knowing the Ashfords were long-standing social rivals of the Hendersons. The flash of competitive recognition in Mrs. Henderson's eyes told me the reference hit its mark. The photography session seemed to proceed without further incident after that, and I returned to my duties overseeing the transition from cocktail hour to dinner reception. The main hall looked spectacular, with candles casting a golden glow over the silk-draped tables and the subtle sparkle of crystal and silver catching the light. The wedding party would be introduced in 20 minutes, then dinner would be served. Was checking the head table setup when one of the Henderson sisters, Vivian, I thought, though I kept mixing up the two, approached me with a look of barely concealed disdain. I need to speak with you about the table arrangements, she said without preamble. Of course, I replied. Is there a concern? You could say that, she replied. My brother Blake and his wife have been seated at table 8 with the Mitchell family cousins. That's completely inappropriate. Blake is the Henderson heir apparent after Richard. He should be at table 1 or 2 with the other immediate family. I consulted the seating chart on my tablet. The seating arrangement was finalized by Allison and Richard last week. Blake and Cynthia are at table 8 because Cynthia's sister is married to Allison's cousin David. They thought they'd enjoy sitting together. Well, they thought wrong, Vivian said. The Henderson side should be arranged by family prominence, not these random connections to the bride's family. I need you to move them immediately. I took a measured breath. I understand your concern, but changing the seating arrangement now would create a cascade of other changes. We're about to open the doors for the reception, and all place cards are set according to the approved plan. So what you're saying is that you're unwilling to accommodate a simple request from the groom's family? Her voice had taken on a dangerous edge. I'm saying that I respect Richard and Allison's wishes for their wedding day, I replied. If they ask me to make this change, I'll do so immediately. Vivian's perfectly made-up face hardened. I don't think you understand who you're dealing with. My family has hosted events for governors and senators. The idea that we would be subjected to this inflexibility is absurd. The threat was getting old, but I maintained my professional demeanor. I'll be happy to check with the bride and groom about this during the next break in their photographs. Would that be acceptable? She pursed her lips. I suppose it will have to be. As she walked away, I made a quick note on my tablet. There was no way I was bothering Allison and Richard with this petty seating drama. I'd simply avoid Vivian until dinner was served, and it was too late to make changes. 6 years in this business had taught me that sometimes the best solution was strategic avoidance. The introduction of the wedding party went perfectly, each pair of bridesmaids and groomsmen entering to applause before the parents of the bride, parents of the groom, and finally, Mr. and Mrs. Richard Henderson. The couple had chosen an upbeat contemporary song for their entrance, and Richard surprised everyone by twirling Allison into a perfect dip as they reached the center of the dance floor. Mrs. Henderson's pinched expression suggested this spontaneous display wasn't dignified enough for her taste, but the rest of the guests cheered appreciatively. Dinner service began promptly, the kitchen team executing flawlessly the menu Allison and Richard had selected, a sophisticated combination of local specialties and elevated comfort foods. I was making a final check on the dessert preparation when Julian found me in the kitchen corridor. We have a situation, he said, his normally unflappable demeanor showing signs of stress. Mr. Henderson Sr. is insisting that the bar switch to serving the wine he brought with him. He apparently smuggled in 6 cases of some rare vintage that isn't on our approved vendor list. I stopped short. He what? How did he even get that past the front gate? Apparently, he had his driver deliver it to the service entrance, claiming it was an approved delivery. The new staff member didn't know to check. I closed my eyes briefly, gathering my patience. Hawthorne Manor, like most professional venues, had strict policies about outside alcohol. Not only did we have exclusive agreements with our licensed beverage providers, but we also had liability concerns and state liquor laws to consider. Where is he now? At the bar, telling our bartenders they don't know how to properly serve wine of this caliber. I found Mr. Henderson exactly where Julian had indicated, lecturing our head bartender, Michael, who had 20 years of fine dining experience and a Level 2 sommelier certification. Michael was maintaining his professional composure, but the tightness around his eyes told me he was at his limit. Mr. Henderson, I said, approaching the bar. I understand there's a question about the wine service? He turned to me with the confidence of a man unaccustomed to hearing the word no. Ah, the coordinator. Yes, I was just explaining to your staff that I've provided a special selection of Chateau Margaux for dinner. A 2005 vintage, far superior to whatever house wine you're serving. I need your people to begin pouring it immediately for the head tables. That's very generous, I said carefully. But I'm afraid we have strict policies about outside alcohol. All beverages must come through our licensed providers, as outlined in the contract. Mr. Henderson waved a dismissive hand. Yes, I'm sure that's your standard line for the average client, but surely you understand that this is an exceptional circumstance. This wine retails for over $200 a bottle. It's what the Hendersons serve at significant family events. The implied insult that his son's wedding would be something less than significant without his wine intervention wasn't lost on me. "I completely understand the sentiment behind your gesture," I said, "but this isn't a matter of preference or quality. It's a legal requirement tied to our liquor license. We simply cannot serve alcohol that hasn't come through proper channels." His expression darkened. "I find it hard to believe you would refuse a simple request that would elevate your establishment's offerings." "It's not a matter of refusal, sir. It's a matter of legality. If we were to serve your wine, we could face significant fines or even lose our license." "I want to speak to the owner," he demanded, raising his voice enough that nearby guests glanced our way. Surely they would understand the absurdity of turning away fine wine over some technicality. The irony of his demand wasn't lost on me, but this wasn't the time to reveal my ownership status. "The owner would tell you exactly the same thing, Mr. Henderson. Our alcohol policies are non-negotiable for legal reasons." For a moment, I thought he might actually create a scene. Then, glancing around at the watching guests, he seemed to reconsider. "This is ridiculous," he muttered. "I've never been treated this way at any respectable establishment." "I apologize for the inconvenience," I said, not sounding particularly sorry. "Our wine selection was personally approved by Richard and Allison. I'm sure you'll find it quite acceptable." As he stalked away, Michael gave me a grateful look. "Thank you." He was about 2 minutes away from opening bottles himself. "Just another day in paradise," I replied with a wry smile. Though I'm beginning to think the Henderson family is going for some kind of difficult client record. Little did I know, the wine incident was merely a prelude to what would happen next. As dinner wound down and the band prepared for the first dance, I found myself wondering what fresh challenge the Hendersons might present. I didn't have to wait long to find out. The cocktail hour following the ceremony took place in Hawthorne Manor's East Garden, where string lights twinkled among ancient oak trees and champagne flowed from crystal fountains. I kept a careful distance from the Henderson family, observing from various vantage points while directing my staff with subtle hand signals. So far, things seemed calm. Mrs. Henderson holding court among friends, Mr. Henderson discussing business with colleagues, and the Henderson sisters taking selfies by the reflection pool. "Emma," Melissa appeared at my side, her voice low. "The photographer wants to know if we should proceed with family photos now or wait until after the cocktail hour as originally planned." I checked my watch. We were running about 10 minutes. Behind schedule. Not unusual for weddings, but enough to require some adjustments. "Let's start now," I decided. "Have them begin with the bride's family first, then the groom's. Make sure the bar is fully stocked before the Henderson family is called away. We don't want anyone getting restless." Melissa nodded and hurried off. I continued my rounds, stopping to chat briefly with guests, ensuring the catering staff was circulating properly with hors d'oeuvres, and checking that the band was set up for the reception. Everything was running smoothly, almost suspiciously so given the earlier drama. "There you are." Julian appeared beside me, a flute of sparkling water in his hand. "The chef wants to confirm we're still on the original dinner timeline." "We're running about 10 minutes behind," I told him, "but we should be able to make that up during the transition to the reception. How's the temperature in the main hall?" "Perfect. I had them adjust the air conditioning after the ceremony. Warm enough for the older guests, cool enough for dancing. Later," I smiled gratefully, "what would I do without you?" "Probably work yourself into an early grave," he replied cheerfully. "Speaking of which, you should eat something. I haven't seen you take a single bite all day." "I will as soon as—" My response was cut short by raised voices coming from the photography area we'd set up near the rose garden. I exchanged a quick glance with Julian before heading in that direction, moving quickly but not running, creating a scene would only make things worse. The tableau that greeted me made my heart sink. The photographer, a talented professional named Carlos who had worked with us many times, stood with a pained expression as Mrs. Henderson berated him, Allison and Richard watched helplessly from the side, the bride's face flushed with embarrassment. Completely unacceptable, Mrs. Henderson was saying as I approached. These pose suggestions are pedestrian at best. The Hendersons have been photographed by Vogue contributors, and you expect us to do these generic wedding stances. Mother, please, Richard interjected. Carlos is excellent. We chose him specifically for his artistic style. That may be, Mrs. Henderson replied, not bothering to lower her voice despite the nearby guests who were now watching with undisguised interest. But he clearly doesn't understand the gravity of photographing our family. These will be historical documents, not just vacation snapshots. I stepped smoothly into the conversation. Mrs. Henderson, is there something I can help with? She turned her imperious gaze on me. Yes, you can arrange for a photographer who understands the significance of the Henderson legacy. This gentleman suggested we pose by that dilapidated garden wall. Dilapidated. For Henderson family portraits. I glanced at the dilapidated wall in question, a weathered stone structure deliberately preserved during our restoration for its historical significance and romantic appeal. It was, in fact, one of our most requested photography backgrounds. Its patina creating a timeless quality that highlighted the subjects rather than competing with them. Carlos is one of the most sought-after wedding photographers in the region, I said calmly. The vintage wall creates a beautiful contrast with formal attire and has been featured in several magazine spreads. However, if you prefer a different backdrop, we have many options. The wall is beautiful, Mother, Richard said firmly. Allison and I selected it specifically. Mrs. Henderson's eyes narrowed. I see I'm outnumbered. Fine. But I want to review each pose before it's taken. The Henderson family has certain standards to maintain. I caught Allison's eye and gave her a subtle nod of encouragement. The poor woman looked like she was calculating the costs of elopement, even at this late stage. I'll leave you in Carlos's capable hands, I said. He's photographed several notable families here, including the Ashfords last summer. I dropped the name deliberately, knowing the Ashfords were long-standing social rivals of the Hendersons. The flash of competitive recognition in Mrs. Henderson's eyes told me the reference hit its mark. The photography session seemed to proceed without further incident after that, and I returned to my duties overseeing the transition from cocktail hour to dinner reception. The main hall looked spectacular, with candles casting a golden glow over the silk-draped tables and the subtle sparkle of crystal and silver catching the light. The wedding party would be introduced in 20 minutes, then dinner would be served. I was checking the head table setup when one of the Henderson sisters, Vivian, I thought, though I kept mixing up the two, approached me with a look of barely concealed disdain. I need to speak with you about the table arrangements, she said without preamble. Of course, I replied. Is there a concern? You could say that, she replied. My brother Blake and his wife have been seated at table 8 with the Mitchell family cousins. That's completely inappropriate. Blake is the Henderson heir apparent after Richard. He should be at table 1 or 2 with the other immediate family. I consulted the seating chart on my tablet. The seating arrangement was finalized by Allison and Richard last week. Blake and Cynthia are at table 8 because Cynthia's sister is married to Allison's cousin David. They thought they'd enjoy sitting together. Well, they thought wrong, Vivian said. The Henderson side should be arranged by family prominence, not these random connections to the bride's family. I need you to move them immediately. I took a measured breath. I understand your concern, but changing the seating arrangement now would create a cascade of other changes. We're about to open the doors for the reception, and all place cards are set according to the approved plan. So, what you're saying is that you're unwilling to accommodate a simple request from the groom's family. Her voice had taken on a dangerous edge. I'm saying that I respect Richard and Allison's wishes for their wedding day, I replied. If they ask me to make this change, I'll do so immediately. Vivian's perfectly made-up face hardened. I don't think you understand who you're dealing with. My family has hosted events for governors and senators. The idea that we would be subjected to this inflexibility is absurd. The threat was getting old, but I maintained my professional demeanor. I'll be happy to check with the bride and groom about this during the next break in their photographs. Would that be acceptable? She pursed her lips. I suppose it will have to be. As she walked away, I made a quick note on my tablet. There was no way I was bothering Allison and Richard with this petty seating drama. I'd simply avoid Vivian until dinner was served and it was too late to make changes. 6 years in this business had taught me that sometimes the best solution was strategic avoidance. The introduction of the wedding party went perfectly, each pair of bridesmaids and groomsmen entering to applause before the parents of the bride, parents of the groom, and finally, Mr. and Mrs. Richard Henderson. The couple had chosen an upbeat contemporary song for their entrance, and Richard surprised everyone by twirling Allison into a perfect dip as they reached the center of the dance floor. Mrs. Henderson's pinched expression suggested this spontaneous display wasn't dignified enough for her taste, but the rest of the guests cheered appreciatively. Dinner service began promptly, the kitchen team executing flawlessly the menu Allison and Richard had selected, a sophisticated combination of local specialties and elevated comfort foods. I was making a final check on the dessert preparation when Julian found me in the kitchen corridor. "We have a situation," he said, his normally unflappable demeanor showing signs of stress. "Mr. Henderson Sr. is insisting that the bar switch to serving the wine he brought with him. He apparently smuggled in 6 cases of some rare vintage that isn't on our approved vendor list." I stopped short. "He what? How did he even get that past the front gate?" "Apparently, he had his driver deliver it to the service entrance claiming it was an approved delivery. The new staff member didn't know to check." I closed my eyes briefly, gathering my patience. Hawthorne Manor, like most professional venues, had strict policies about outside alcohol. Not only did we have exclusive agreements with our licensed beverage providers, but we also had liability concerns and state liquor laws to consider. Where is he now? At the bar, telling our bartenders they don't know how to properly serve wine of this caliber. I found Mr. Henderson exactly where Julian had indicated, lecturing our head bartender, Michael, who had 20 years of fine dining experience and a Level 2 sommelier certification. Michael was maintaining his professional composure, but the gas tightness around his eyes told me he was at his limit. "Mr. Henderson," I said, approaching the bar, "I understand there's a question about the wine service." He turned to me with the confidence of a man unaccustomed to hearing the word no. "Ah, the coordinator. Yes, I was just explaining to your staff that I've provided a special selection of Chateau Margaux for dinner, a 2005 vintage, far superior to whatever house wine you're serving. I need your people to begin pouring it immediately for the head tables." "That's very generous," I said carefully, "but I'm afraid we have strict policies about outside alcohol. All beverages must come through our licensed providers, as outlined in the contract." Mr. Henderson waved a dismissive hand. Yes, I'm sure that's your standard line for the average client. But surely you understand that this is an exceptional circumstance? This wine retails for over $1,200 a bottle. It's what the Hendersons serve at significant family events. The implied insult that his son's wedding would be something less than significant without his wine intervention wasn't lost on me. "I completely understand the sentiment behind your gesture," I said. "But this isn't a matter of preference or quality. It's a legal requirement tied to our liquor license. We simply cannot serve alcohol that hasn't come through proper channels." His expression darkened. "I find it hard to believe you would refuse a simple request that would elevate your establishment's offerings. It's not a matter of refusal, sir. It's a matter of legality. If we were to serve your wine, we could face significant fines or even lose our license." "I want to speak to the owner," he demanded, raising his voice enough that nearby guests glanced our way. Surely they would understand the absurdity of turning away fine wine over some technicality. The irony of his demand wasn't lost on me, but this wasn't the time to reveal my ownership status. The owner would tell you exactly the same thing, Mr. Henderson. Our alcohol policies are non-negotiable for legal reasons. For a moment, I thought he might actually create a scene. Then, glancing around at the watching guests, he seemed to reconsider. "This is ridiculous," he muttered. "I've never been treated this way at any respectable establishment." "I apologize for the inconvenience," I said, not sounding particularly sorry. "Our wine selection was personally approved by Richard and Allison. I'm sure you'll find it quite acceptable." As he stalked away, Michael gave me a grateful look. "Thank you." He was about 2 minutes away from opening bottles himself. "Just another day in paradise," I replied with a wry smile. Though I'm beginning to think the Henderson family is going for some kind of difficult client record. Little did I know, the wine incident was merely a prelude to what would happen next. As dinner wound down and the band prepared for the first dance, I found myself wondering what fresh challenge the Hendersons might present. I didn't have to wait long to find out. Mrs. Henderson stared at me, her perfectly lined lips parting in shock. "I beg your pardon?" "I own Hawthorne Manor," I repeated calmly. "I purchased it 4 years ago and personally oversaw its restoration. I'm not just the coordinator. I'm the proprietor of this inadequate venue you've been insulting all day." Her expressions cycled rapidly through disbelief, embarrassment, and then, remarkably, indignation. "That's absurd. Someone like you couldn't possibly own a multi-million-dollar property and successful business," I finished for her. "I assure you I can and I do. The deed, business license, and tax returns all bear my name. Now, about that honeymoon you canceled without authorization." "If you truly are the owner," she said, emphasizing the word with obvious skepticism, "then you should understand the importance of accommodating prominent families. The Hendersons have significant influence in this community." "So you've mentioned." Repeatedly. I checked my watch. "Mrs. Henderson, we have 20 minutes until your son and his bride depart. That gives you precisely 20 minutes to contact whatever travel agency or assistant you use to cancel their honeymoon and have it reinstated, exactly as they planned it." "And if I refuse?" she challenged, apparently still unconvinced of my authority. I met her gaze directly. "Then I'll be forced to inform Richard and Allison what you've done. Tonight, before they leave. Is that really how you want their wedding day to end?" For the first time, uncertainty flickered across her face. Despite her breathtaking entitlement, even she seemed to recognize that her son might not react well to this particular interference. "You wouldn't dare," she said, but her voice lacked conviction. "I take my responsibility to my clients very seriously," I replied. "If you won't protect their interests, I will. Even if it means delivering unpleasant news on their wedding night." She studied me with new calculation in her eyes. "You're bluffing." "Would you like to find out?" I took a step toward the dance floor where Richard and Allison were laughing with friends. "I can call them over right now." "Wait," she said sharply, then lowered her voice when a nearby guest glanced our way. "Fine, I'll make a call. But this isn't over, Ms. Lawson." "Wonderful," I replied with professional brightness. "I'll give you some privacy for your call. The small study off the east corridor should work nicely." As Mrs. Henderson stalked away, phone already in hand, I exhaled slowly. Revealing my ownership hadn't been part of tonight's plan, but the situation had left me little choice. I had no doubt Mrs. Henderson would find some way to retaliate for this humiliation, but that was a problem for tomorrow. Tonight, my only concern was ensuring Richard and Allison got the honeymoon they had planned. I sought out Mrs. Mitchell, who was speaking with her husband near the dessert table, her expression still strained. "Mrs. Henderson is working to reinstate the original honeymoon reservations," I informed them quietly. "I believe the situation will be resolved shortly." "Thank you," Mrs. Mitchell said fervently. "I don't understand how anyone could be so presumptuous." That woman has been impossible since the engagement was announced, but this crosses every line. "Should we tell Allison?" Mr. Mitchell asked, looking concerned. I considered the question carefully. "I think it might be best to wait until we confirm the original reservations have been restored. There's no need to upset them if the situation is being resolved." They both nodded in agreement. "Thank you for handling this," Mrs. Mitchell said, touching my arm gratefully. "You've been remarkable throughout this entire day." I smiled, appreciating her kindness. "It's been my pleasure to help make Richard and Allison's vision a reality, despite certain challenges." Julian appeared at my side, looking slightly harried. "5 minutes until the send-off," he murmured. "Is everything set with the sparklers?" "Should be," I replied. "Melissa was organizing the distribution team when I last checked." "I'll confirm," he said. "Also, Mrs. Henderson asked me to find you. She's in the study." I excused myself from the Mitchells and made my way to the small study, where I found Mrs. Henderson ending a phone call. Her expression was unreadable as she looked up at me. "Well?" I asked. "The original reservations have been reinstated," she said stiffly, "though I maintain that my son will be disappointed when he sees the accommodations." "I'm sure he'll manage somehow," I replied dryly. "Thank you for rectifying the situation." She stood, smoothing her already immaculate dress. "I want you to understand something, Ms. Lawson. Regardless of your claimed position here, you've made a serious mistake tonight. The Hendersons aren't accustomed to being spoken to this way, and we certainly don't forget those who disrespect us." The threat hung in the air between us. Under different circumstances, from someone with actual power over my livelihood, it might have been intimidating. But standing in my own property, secure in the knowledge that my business was thriving without Henderson patronage, I found it almost laughable. "Mrs. Henderson," I said, "I want you to understand something as well. I've built this business through hard work, integrity, and treating every client with respect, regardless of their surname or social position. What I won't tolerate is anyone trying to control, manipulate, or ruin a couple's wedding day, especially not a member of their own family." She drew herself up indignantly. "How dare you imply—" "I'm not implying anything," I interrupted, my patience exhausted. "I'm stating facts, supported by your behavior throughout this entire day. Now, your son and his bride are about to depart. I suggest we both join the send-off line and save this conversation for another time." Without waiting for her response, I turned and left the study, focusing on the task at hand, ensuring Richard and Allison had a perfect exit from their reception, unmarred by Henderson family drama. Outside the Manor's grand entrance, guests had formed 2 lines, sparklers ready to illuminate the couple's path to their waiting car. The wedding party was positioned at the end closest to the door, with family members behind them, followed by friends and colleagues. I spotted Mrs. Henderson hurrying to join her husband near the front of the line, her social mask firmly back. In place. Melissa approached with a tablet in hand. "Everything's ready. The driver has their luggage loaded, sparklers are distributed, and the photographer is positioned for the exit shots." "Perfect," I said. "Let's give them a beautiful send-off." Inside, I found Richard and Allison saying their final goodbyes to close friends. Allison had changed from her wedding gown into an elegant white cocktail dress for traveling, while Richard had removed his formal jacket and tie but still looked perfectly put together. "Are you ready for your grand exit?" I asked them with a genuine smile. "More than ready," Allison replied, looking both happy and exhausted, the normal state for most brides by the end of their reception. "It was perfect, Emma," Richard added, surprising me by clasping my hand warmly. "Thank you for everything, especially for handling my family with such grace." His knowing look suggested he was far more aware of his family's difficult behavior than I'd realized. "Just doing my job," I assured him. "Well above and beyond," Allison said. I don't know how you managed to keep everything running so smoothly with— She glanced at Richard and seemed to reconsider her words. With all the various opinions being offered. That's a very diplomatic way of putting it, Richard said with a rueful smile. Let's be honest, my family was a nightmare today. I saw enough to know that. His frankness was refreshing. Every wedding has its challenges, I said diplomatically. Yours also had many beautiful moments. Thanks to you, Allison replied. Now, I believe you mentioned guests with sparklers waiting for us? I led them to the main entrance, pausing just inside the doors. When you're ready, you'll walk through the sparkler tunnel to your car. The driver knows to take you directly to the hotel for tonight, and your flight to Belize leaves tomorrow at 11 a.m. I emphasized the destination slightly, relieved that their honeymoon plans had been restored without their ever knowing about Mrs. Henderson's interference. Perfect, Richard said, taking Allison's hand. Ready, Mrs. Henderson? Absolutely, Mr. Henderson, she replied with a radiant smile. I nodded to Julian, who signaled the doormen to open the grand doors. Outside, guests cheered as the couple appeared, and the sparklers were lit in sequence, creating a glittering pathway to the vintage Rolls-Royce waiting at the end of the drive. Richard and Allison moved through the tunnel of light, stopping occasionally to hug a friend or family member. When they reached his parents, Mrs. Henderson embraced her son stiffly, whispering something in his ear that made his smile falter momentarily. But then Allison took his hand again, and whatever shadow had passed was gone as they continued toward their car. The driver held the door as Richard helped Allison into the back seat, then rounded the car to climb in beside her. As the Rolls-Royce pulled away to continued cheers and applause, I felt the familiar mixture of satisfaction and relief that came with successfully executing a wedding, especially one as challenging as this. Guests began to drift back inside. For the final half hour of the reception, the sparklers extinguished and collected by my staff. As the crowd thinned, I noticed Mrs. Henderson standing alone, watching the taillights of her son's car disappear down the long driveway. For a brief moment, I thought I glimpsed something like regret on her face, a recognition, perhaps, that her controlling behavior had only succeeded in pushing her son further away. Then she turned, saw me watching, and the vulnerable expression vanished, replaced by her usual cold disdain. She rejoined her husband without acknowledging me further. Well, that's that, Julian said, appearing beside me. Crisis managed, couple safely dispatched. Now we just need to shepherd the remaining guests through the last rounds and send them on their way. And then maybe that drink you mentioned earlier, I suggested. He grinned. I already have a bottle of the good stuff chilling in your office for the senior staff debrief. You're a treasure, I told him sincerely. I know, he replied with a wink. Though I'm not the one who faced down the terrifying Mrs. Henderson and lived to tell the tale. The night's not over yet, I reminded him. Let's make sure the Hendersons leave without any further dramatics. The remaining half hour passed quickly as the band played their final set and the bar served last rounds. The Henderson family departed. As a group, Mr. Henderson and their daughters practically dragging Mrs. Henderson away before she could engage me in another confrontation. Their exit left a palpable sense of relief in their wake. By 12:30 a.m., the last guest had departed, and my team began the efficient breakdown and cleanup process that would return Hawthorne Manor to pristine condition by morning. I circulated, among them, thanking staff members for their exceptional work under difficult circumstances, making notes of any issues to address before our next event. When the public areas were sufficiently organized, I gathered my senior staff, Julian, Melissa, our catering manager, and our head of security, in my office for our traditional post-event debrief. Before we start, Julian said, pouring champagne into 5 flutes, I think we should toast the owner who finally revealed herself to put an entitled client in her place. I laughed, accepting a glass. It wasn't my finest professional moment. It was magnificent, Melissa countered. The look on her face when you told her you owned the place, I would have paid good money to see that. Well, we've probably lost any future Henderson business, I said, only half joking. Oh no. However will we survive without their charming presence? Julian deadpanned, causing everyone to laugh. We did a quick review of the evening. What worked well? What could be improved for future events? Any vendor issues to address? Despite the Henderson family drama, the operational aspects of the wedding had gone remarkably smoothly. What do you think will happen when they find out about the honeymoon interference? Melissa asked as we concluded our meeting. I shrugged. That's between them and the Hendersons. My job was to give them the perfect wedding day. What happens after that is family business. As my team filed out, tired but satisfied with a job well done, I remained in my office, gazing out the window at Hawthorne Manor's moonlit gardens. 6 years ago, I'd entered the wedding industry as an assistant coordinator, learning the business from the ground up. 4 years ago, I'd taken the biggest risk of my life, investing everything I had to purchase this neglected historical property when no one else saw its potential. The journey hadn't been easy. There had been skeptics who doubted a young woman could successfully restore and run such a significant venue, lenders who questioned my business acumen, and countless clients who assumed I was just the coordinator rather than the owner. But moments like tonight, standing my ground against someone who thought their family name trumped common decency, reminded me why I'd created Hawthorne Manor. Not just as a beautiful backdrop for celebrations, but as a place where couples could realize their unique vision for their most important day, regardless of anyone else's expectations or demands. Mrs. Henderson's threats held no power over me, because I had built something valuable on my own terms. No family name, no inherited privilege, just hard work and determination. As I turned off the lights in my office and prepared to leave, I couldn't help but smile at the irony. The woman who had spent all day looking down on me, threatening my livelihood, and insisting I couldn't possibly understand proper standards, had been standing in my house the entire time. Sometimes, justice served itself in the most satisfying ways. 2 weeks after the Henderson-Mitchell wedding, I was reviewing applications for a new assistant coordinator when Melissa knocked on my office door, her expression a mixture of amusement and concern. "You have visitors," she announced. "Mr. and Mrs. Henderson." For a moment I thought she meant Richard and Allison, but her expression told me otherwise. "Senior or junior?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. "Senior. Very senior. Mrs. Henderson looks like she's been sucking lemons for breakfast." I closed my laptop with a sigh. "Show them in, please." "Are you sure?" I could tell them you're in a meeting. The offer was tempting. "No, better to face whatever this is directly, but stand by for rescue if I text you the SOS code." "Roger that," Melissa replied with mock seriousness. "I'll have Julian on standby with a fake emergency." A minute later, Mr. and Mrs. Henderson were seated across from me, looking exactly as they had during the wedding, impeccably dressed, exuding wealth and privilege, and in Mrs. Henderson's case, barely concealed hostility. "Mr. and Mrs. Henderson," I greeted them cordially. "This is a surprise. What can I do for you today?" "Ms. Lawson," Mr. Henderson began, his tone businesslike. "We wanted to address some concerns about our son's wedding." "I see," I replied, neutrally. "I hope Richard and Allison enjoyed their honeymoon in Belize." Mrs. Henderson's mouth tightened at the pointed reference. "That's actually related to why we're here," she said. "Our son was quite upset to learn about certain interactions between us during his wedding day." "I'm sorry to hear that," I said, though I wasn't particularly surprised. "May I ask which interaction specifically?" "Richard seems to believe that I attempted to interfere with his honeymoon plans," Mrs. Henderson said stiffly. "He claims you informed him of this." I raised an eyebrow. "I never discussed the honeymoon situation with Richard or Allison. In fact, I specifically worked to resolve the issue without troubling them on their wedding day. Mr. Henderson cleared his throat. Apparently, the resort in Belize contacted them upon arrival to confirm that their reservation had been temporarily canceled and then reinstated. They mentioned it was done through a Mrs. Henderson, and Richard put the pieces together. "I see," I said. "That's unfortunate, but it hardly involves me. I simply encouraged Mrs. Henderson to rectify the situation she had created." "By threatening me," Mrs. Henderson interjected sharply. "By pointing out the consequences of your actions," I corrected. "I gave you the opportunity to resolve the situation privately, which you did. What happened after was beyond my control." Mr. Henderson held up a placating hand. "We're not here to assign blame, Ms. Lawson. We're here because Richard and Allison returned from their honeymoon yesterday, and they've made certain stipulations regarding family events moving forward. Again, I'm not sure how this involves me or Hawthorne Manor," I said carefully. Mrs. Henderson's expression suggested she'd rather be anywhere else as her husband continued. "Richard has informed us that all future family events, holidays, anniversaries, birthdays, and any future celebrations involving his children will only be held at venues where he and Allison have complete control over the guest list and arrangements." I began to see where this was heading. "And he suggested Hawthorne Manor specifically?" He said, and I quote, "Emma Lawson was the only person who stood up for our wishes on our wedding day. If we're going to have family gatherings, they'll be on neutral ground where someone will enforce our boundaries." Mr. Henderson looked distinctly uncomfortable repeating his son's words. I couldn't help but feel a surge of satisfaction, though I kept my expression professional. "I see. And you're here to book your venue for Thanksgiving," Mrs. Henderson said, the words clearly costing her considerable pride. "And potentially Christmas, depending on availability." The irony was almost too perfect. After a day of disparaging Hawthorne Manor as inadequate for a Henderson event, she was now being forced back to secure future bookings. "I understand," I said, opening my scheduling software. "Let me check our availability. Thanksgiving is quite popular, as you might imagine." "Price is not a concern," Mr. Henderson added quickly. Richard was quite adamant about the location. I studied the calendar, noting that we did, in fact, have Thanksgiving available. A recent cancellation had opened the date. But I wasn't about to make this easy for them after their behavior. "We do have limited availability around Thanksgiving," I said carefully. "Though our holiday package is significantly more expensive than our standard events, given the demand." As I said, "Price is not an issue," Mr. Henderson repeated. I named a figure approximately 30% higher than our actual holiday rate. Mr. Henderson didn't even blink. "That's acceptable," he said. "We'll need the venue from noon until 8 in the evening, with full catering and service staff." "And regarding Christmas?" I asked, knowing we were indeed fully booked for the holiday itself, though we had availability the weekend before. "The 23rd would be preferable if possible," Mr. Henderson said. "Richard and Allison are spending Christmas Day with the Mitchells." I could only imagine how well that news had gone over with Mrs. Henderson, who sat rigidly in her chair, letting her husband handle the negotiations. "We do have the 23rd available," I confirmed. "Same holiday pricing would apply." "Fine," he said, briskly. "We'd like to secure both dates today." I pulled out our standard contract forms. "Of course. I'll just need to go through our policies and procedures with you, particularly regarding our guest list protocols and outside vendor restrictions." Mrs. Henderson shifted uncomfortably at the reference to vendors, no doubt remembering the wine incident. "Additionally," I continued, "since these will be family events rather than public functions, I should clarify that I won't be personally coordinating them. One of our other experienced coordinators will be assigned to your events." "Richard specifically mentioned your involvement," Mrs. Henderson finally spoke up. "He seems to think you're essential to maintaining the appropriate atmosphere." I'm flattered, I replied. But as the owner, I typically only coordinate a limited number of events personally. However, I'd be happy to meet with Richard and Allison to discuss their vision for these family gatherings and ensure my staff understands their priorities. Mrs. Henderson's lips thinned at the reminder of my ownership status, but she nodded stiffly. Now, I continued, pushing the contract forms across the desk. If you'll just review these standard terms, you'll note Section 6.2 specifically addresses our policies on respecting the host's wishes regarding all aspects of the event. Mr. Henderson skimmed the contracts before signing them without comment. His wife's signature was added with noticeably less enthusiasm. We'll require a 50% deposit to secure the dates, I advised them, with the balance due 2 weeks before each event. Mr. Henderson removed a checkbook from his jacket pocket. Will a check be acceptable? Of course. As he wrote the check, Mrs. Henderson finally addressed me directly. I hope you understand, Ms. Lawson, that this arrangement is solely for Richard's benefit. Our personal opinion of your establishment remains unchanged. I accepted the check, with a polite smile. I completely understand, Mrs. Henderson. You're making a sacrifice for your son's happiness. That's what good parents do, isn't it? Put their children's wishes above their own preferences? The barb landed precisely as intended. Mrs. Henderson's eyes narrowed, but before she could respond, her husband placed a restraining hand on her arm. Thank you for accommodating us on short notice, he said, rising to indicate the meeting was over. We'll be in touch regarding specific arrangements closer to the dates. As they departed, I couldn't help but reflect on the extraordinary turn of events. The Hendersons, who had spent an entire wedding day treating me and my venue with contempt, were now locked into holding family gatherings here for the foreseeable future, all because their son had recognized and appreciated my efforts to protect his and Allison's wishes. Melissa appeared in my doorway the moment they left. Well, what was that about? I handed her the contracts and check. We'll be hosting Henderson family Thanksgiving and Christmas this year. Apparently, Richard has insisted all family gatherings be held on neutral ground where someone will enforce their boundaries. Her eyes widened. No way. This venue is beneath us. Henderson agreed to that? Not willingly, I said with a smile. But it seems Richard has laid down the law. They either respect his and Allison's wishes, or they don't. See their son. And part of those wishes includes holding events here. That's... Melissa searched for the right word. Poetic justice? Something like that, I agreed. Though I almost feel sorry for them. Almost. Well, Thanksgiving should be interesting, she said. Want me to schedule you for a convenient vacation that week? I laughed. Tempting, but no. I told them I wouldn't personally coordinate their events, but I think I'll make an exception for the first one. Just to set the right tone. And by right tone, you mean making sure Mrs. Henderson knows exactly who's in charge of the manor? Precisely, I confirmed. Though I'll be perfectly professional, of course. Of course, Melissa echoed with a knowing smile. Completely professional while watching her squirm every time she has to ask you for something in the venue she spent an entire day insulting. I never said I wasn't petty, I admitted. Just professional. Later that afternoon, I received an email from Allison Henderson, thanking me for accepting their family's holiday bookings. The message was warm and genuine, expressing appreciation for my subtle but firm enforcement of boundaries during their wedding day. Richard and I realized during our honeymoon that we need to establish clear expectations with his family from the very beginning, she wrote. Having our family gatherings at Hawthorne Manor, where you've created such a respectful and professional environment, feels like the perfect solution. We know his family can't steamroll you the way they might a restaurant or other venue. TT. Email concluded with a request to meet for coffee the following week to discuss their vision for the upcoming family events. I replied with several available times, genuinely looking forward to seeing how the newlyweds had fared during their first weeks of marriage. As I finished for the day, I paused to look out over Hawthorne Manor's grounds from my office window. The late afternoon sun cast a golden glow over the gardens where the Henderson-Mitchell wedding ceremony had taken place just 2 weeks earlier. So much had happened that day. Challenges, confrontations, and ultimately, a kind of victory for respect and boundaries. When I purchased this property, I'd envisioned creating a space where couples could celebrate their unique love stories without interference or judgment. What I hadn't anticipated was how sometimes that would mean standing up to difficult family members who tried to impose their own visions on the couple's day. The Henderson family had tested my professional resolve in ways I'd never experienced before, but in doing so, they'd also affirmed the value of what I'd created here, not just a beautiful venue, but a protected space where couples' wishes were paramount, regardless of family pressure or social expectations. Mrs. Henderson might never appreciate Hawthorne Manor or respect me as its owner. But her son and daughter-in-law did, enough to make this their sanctuary for family gatherings going forward. And somehow that felt like the perfect conclusion to what had begun with insults at the altar. Sometimes I reflected, the best revenge isn't dramatic confrontation or burning bridges. It's simply standing your ground, doing what's right, and letting the consequences unfold naturally. In this case, those consequences had delivered the Henderson family right back to my doorstep, under terms they couldn't control. I couldn't wait for Thanksgiving. The weeks leading up to Thanksgiving were filled with the usual flurry of autumn weddings and events at Hawthorne Manor. We had fully booked weekends through early November, which kept me too busy to dwell much on the upcoming Henderson family gathering. I'd met with Richard and Allison as planned, finding them relaxed and happy after their honeymoon. They'd shared their vision for a neutral ground Thanksgiving that would honor both families' traditions while establishing new boundaries. My tea. Mother has already tried to change the menu 3 times, Richard had confided with a rueful smile. I keep referring her back to you. She's called twice, I confirmed. I explained that all changes need to come directly from you and Allison, as specified in the contract. That must have gone over well, Allison said with a knowing look. Let's just say Mrs. Henderson is becoming quite familiar with our policies. The week before Thanksgiving, I convened a special staff meeting to prepare my team for the Henderson event. It wasn't our largest or most complex booking of the season, but it did require particular attention given the history. A few things to keep in mind, I told my assembled staff in the main hall. First, the hosts are Richard and Allison Henderson, not Mr. and Mrs. Henderson Sr., regardless of who might try to tell you otherwise. All decisions and approvals come from the younger Hendersons only. Julian, who had witnessed the wedding, day drama firsthand, nodded in understanding. So if Mrs. Henderson Sr. starts rearranging table settings or changing the music playlist, you direct her to speak with Richard and Allison or with me, I confirmed. Second, we've arranged seating according to the chart provided by the hosts. There should be no changes to this arrangement without explicit approval from Richard or Allison. Even if someone claims to be doing it on their behalf? Asked one of our newer staff members. Especially then, I said firmly. Third, we have specific instructions regarding alcohol service. Only the pre-selected wines and spirits on the approved list are to be served. No outside beverages are permitted, even if they arrive in Mr. Henderson Sr.'s car. This earned knowing smiles from those who had worked the wedding. And finally, I concluded, remember that while this is a family gathering rather than a wedding, our commitment to providing exceptional service remains the same. The Hendersons may be a challenging family, but they're important to Richard and Allison, who are our actual clients. The day before Thanksgiving brought an unexpected visitor to Hawthorne Manor. I was inspecting the table settings in the smaller of our 2 dining halls. We'd selected the more intimate space for the Henderson Thanksgiving, which would host only 20 guests, when Melissa announced Mrs. Mitchell's arrival. Allison's mother? I confirmed, surprised. Is everything all right? She seems fine, Melissa assured me. Said she just wanted a word when you have a moment. I found Mrs. Mitchell waiting in the reception area, elegant in a casual autumn ensemble of camel slacks and a burgundy sweater. She greeted me warmly. "Emma, thank you for seeing me without an appointment. I hope I'm not interrupting your preparations." "Not at all," I assured her. "Would you like to sit in my office, or perhaps take a walk through the gardens? The fall colors are quite beautiful right now." "The gardens would be lovely," she decided. "I could use some fresh air after the drive." As we strolled along the gravel paths winding through Hawthorne Manor's formal gardens, now adorned in the rich golds and crimsons of late autumn, Mrs. Mitchell seemed to be gathering her thoughts. "I wanted to thank you," she finally said, "for everything you did at Richard and Allison's wedding, and for agreeing to host our Thanksgiving tomorrow. I know the Hendersons can be difficult." "It's my pleasure," I replied diplomatically. "Richard and Allison are a delightful couple, and we're happy to create the environment they're looking for." "That's just it," Mrs. Mitchell said, stopping to look at me directly. "You've created more than just an environment. You've given them a safe space to establish their marriage on their own terms." Her sincerity touched me. "That's honestly the best part of what I do," I admitted. "Not just creating beautiful events, but helping couples navigate the sometimes complicated transition from being part of their individual families to forming their own." "Well, you've been remarkable at it," she said. "But I wanted to warn you, Victoria Henderson called me yesterday." I raised an eyebrow, surprised that Richard's sister would contact her new sister-in-law's mother. "What did she want?" "To form an alliance, if you can believe it," Mrs. Mitchell said with a small laugh. "She suggested that both families should present a united front at Thanksgiving to encourage Richard and Allison to reconsider their restrictive approach to family gatherings, meaning they want to pressure the couple into abandoning the neutral ground concept." I translated. "Exactly." I declined, of course. I told her I think Richard and Allison have made a reasonable decision by choosing a beautiful venue where everyone can enjoy the holiday without the baggage of past family dynamics. How did she take that? "Not well," Mrs. Mitchell admitted. She implied that my support of this arrangement suggests I don't value proper family traditions. I shook my head, unsurprised, but still somewhat amazed by the Henderson family's persistence. "What do you think they're planning?" "I'm not entirely sure," she replied, "but I thought you should know they might be coming with some kind of agenda tomorrow. Victoria mentioned something about their father planning to clear the air once and for all." "Thank you for the warning," I said sincerely. "We'll be prepared for whatever they might have in mind." Mrs. Mitchell smiled warmly. "I've learned over the years that the best gift we can give our adult children is respect for their choices, even when they differ from what we might have chosen." The Hendersons seem to be struggling with that concept. "Some people find it harder than others to adapt to changing family dynamics," I agreed diplomatically. "Well, I have complete faith in your ability to handle whatever tomorrow brings," she said as we completed our circuit of the gardens. "After all, you managed their wedding day beautifully despite far more challenging circumstances." After she departed, I immediately sought out Julian to alert him to the potential for Henderson family machinations at tomorrow's Thanksgiving. "So we're expecting what exactly?" he asked pragmatically. "A hostile takeover of the turkey carving? A coup d'etat of the cranberry sauce?" "I'm not sure," I admitted. "But Mrs. Mitchell's warning suggests they might try to use the gathering to pressure Richard and Allison into abandoning this neutral ground approach for future family events, which would mean no more lucrative Henderson bookings for Hawthorne Manor," Julian noted with mock seriousness. "A tragedy for our bottom line, truly." I laughed despite my concerns. Financially, we'd survive without their business. But this isn't about that. It's about supporting Richard and Allison's boundaries. "Of course it is," Julian agreed, his expression softening. "And we will. The entire staff is well versed in Operation Henderson containment protocols." He gave a dramatic military salute. "You're ridiculous," I told him fondly. "But I appreciate the support. Let's just hope tomorrow goes smoothly. Thanksgiving morning dawned clear and crisp, perfect weather for the holiday. I arrived at Hawthorne Manor earlier than usual, wanting to personally oversee every detail of the preparation. The dining room looked magnificent, with a long table dressed in autumn-hued linens, elegant place settings, and centerpieces of seasonal flowers, fruits, and candles running the length of the table. A fireplace at one end of the room created a warm, inviting atmosphere. The chef and his team were already busy in the kitchen, the aromas of roasting turkey, herbs, and baking pies filling the air. The menu was a carefully crafted blend of traditional Thanksgiving dishes and a few special additions that held significance. For both families, Richard's grandmother's chestnut stuffing recipe alongside Allison's family's cranberry relish, classic mashed potatoes and gravy paired with the Mitchell family's traditional corn pudding. "Everything looks perfect," I told the chef as I reviewed the final preparations. "Thank you for accommodating all the special requests." "No problem," he replied cheerfully. "Though I've never had to provide so many samples and detailed descriptions for a single family meal before." Mrs. Henderson Sr. was quite thorough in her inquiries. I sighed. "I can imagine. But the final menu was approved by Richard and Allison, yes?" "Absolutely. We're following their instructions to the letter." At precisely noon, the first guests began to arrive. The Mitchells came as a group: Allison's parents, her younger brother and his wife, and her elderly grandmother. They were warm and appreciative, exclaiming over the beauty of the manor in its autumn decor. Richard and Allison arrived next, bringing with them a palpable excitement for their first holiday as a married couple. Allison looked radiant in a rust-colored dress that complemented her dark hair, while Richard seemed more relaxed than I'd seen him at the wedding, his arm comfortably around his wife's waist. "This is wonderful, Emma," Allison said, taking in the decorated space. "Exactly what we envisioned." "The table is beautiful," Richard agreed. "Thank you for making this special for us." They had just begun greeting the Mitchell family when the Henderson contingent arrived en masse. Mr. and Mrs. Henderson, both sisters, with their husbands, Richard's brother Blake and his wife, and what appeared to be a couple of cousins. They made a striking entrance, dressed in coordinating autumn tones as if they'd planned a family photo session. Mrs. Henderson paused just inside the doorway, surveying the room with the critical eye I remembered well from the wedding. If she was impressed by the elegant setting, she gave no indication, merely nodding stiffly in my direction before moving to greet her son. I remained discreetly near the entrance, ready to direct servers and address any issues while staying out of the family dynamics as much as possible. The cocktail hour proceeded without incident, guests mingling with drinks in hand before being invited to find their place cards for dinner. It was then that I noticed the first sign of the predicted trouble. Mrs. Henderson and her daughters had clustered at the table, examining the place cards with evident disapproval. I moved closer, just in time to hear Victoria saying, "This simply won't work. Blake needs to be seated next to Father to discuss the Anderson acquisition. And Mother should be at the head of the table," her sister added. "It's tradition." "Actually," I interjected smoothly, "the seating arrangement was carefully planned by Richard and Allison. As the hosts, they'll be seated at either end of the table." Mrs. Henderson turned to me with a tight smile. "Ms. Lawson, how convenient that you're hovering nearby. Perhaps you could explain why our family is scattered throughout the seating, rather than grouped together as is customary." "I believe Richard and Allison wanted to create a blended seating arrangement to encourage interaction between both families," I explained. "They approved the final plan yesterday." "Well, it needs adjustment," Mrs. Henderson declared. "Family should sit with family, especially for the first Thanksgiving with new in-laws. I'm sure the Mitchells would agree." From across the room, I caught Richard's eye. He'd noticed the huddle around the table and was making his way over, a determined expression on his face. The Henderson sisters fell silent as he approached. "Is there a problem with the seating?" he asked, his tone pleasant but firm. "Darling, "The arrangement is a bit unconventional," his mother replied. "We were just discussing some minor adjustments that would make more sense for family dynamics." Richard's expression remained calm, but I noticed his jaw tighten slightly. "The seating plan is exactly as Allison and I requested. Everyone will sit according to their assigned place cards, with no adjustments." For a moment I thought Mrs. Henderson might argue further, but Mr. Henderson appeared at her side, placing a gentle hand on her arm. "Come, Eleanor, let's find our seats as Richard has arranged them. It's their Thanksgiving, after all." The pointed reminder seemed to have its intended effect. With a final disapproving glance at the place cards, Mrs. Henderson allowed her husband to guide her away. The potential crisis averted. For now, at least, I caught Richard's eye and gave him a subtle nod of approval. He returned a small, grateful smile before rejoining Allison. The opening skirmish had been resolved in the host's favor, but I had a feeling the Henderson family's clear-the-air agenda was just getting started. The guests found their places at the table with minimal additional grumbling. Richard and Allison took their positions at opposite ends, a deliberate choice that divided the hosting responsibilities equally between them. The seating arrangement alternated members of both families, preventing any single faction from dominating the conversation. Mrs. Henderson was seated midway down the table, well away from either host position that might have suggested authority, a detail I suspected wasn't lost on her. Once everyone was settled, Richard stood to welcome his guests. "Allison and I are so happy to have both our families together for our first Thanksgiving as a married couple," he began warmly. "We've chosen to start some new traditions this year, while honoring the best of what both our families have always valued. The menu includes dishes special to both the Hendersons and the Mitchells." He raised his glass. "To family, those we were born to and those we choose, and to new beginnings." It was a gracious toast that acknowledged both families while subtly asserting the couple's independence. Most guests responded enthusiastically, though I noticed Mrs. Henderson merely touched her lips to her wine glass without drinking. The first course was served smoothly, a butternut squash soup garnished with toasted pumpkin seeds and a swirl of creme fraiche. Conversation around the table remained polite, if somewhat stilted, as everyone seemed to be feeling out the new family dynamic. I circulated discreetly, checking that service was proceeding as planned, and keeping a watchful eye for any signs of trouble. The staff performed impeccably, serving and clearing courses with minimal intrusion on the family gathering. It was during the main course, roast turkey with all the traditional sides, that Mr. Henderson Sr. cleared his throat and tapped his knife gently against his water glass, drawing everyone's attention. "I'd like to say a few words, if I may," he announced. Richard and Allison exchanged a quick glance that suggested this wasn't part of their planned program. Mrs. Mitchell's warning about the Hendersons planning to clear the air immediately came to mind. "Dad?" Richard's tone held a note of caution. "Just a brief toast, son," Mr. Henderson assured him with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "It seems appropriate as we gather for this first family holiday to address the elephant in the room." The table fell silent. I positioned myself near the doorway to the kitchen, ready to intervene if necessary, but trying to remain unobtrusive. "The Henderson family has hosted Thanksgiving at our home for 3 generations, Mr. Henderson continued. "It's a tradition that has defined our family gatherings, just as the Grand Summit has hosted our weddings. And our summer home has been the setting for our 4th of July celebrations." He paused, looking directly at Richard. "These traditions have meaning. They connect us to our history, to who we are as a family." Mrs. Henderson was nodding in agreement, a satisfied expression on her face. Clearly, this speech had been planned between them. "When traditions change," Mr. Henderson went on, "it can feel like a rejection of that history, of our family identity." Allison's father shifted uncomfortably in his seat, while her mother watched with a concerned expression. The tension around the table was palpable. However, Mr. Henderson's voice softened slightly. "I've been reminded recently that traditions only remain meaningful if they evolve with the family they serve. This unexpected turn seemed to surprise Mrs. Henderson, whose smug expression faltered. "Richard, Allison," he continued, raising his glass, "your mother and I, all of us, need to acknowledge that you're beginning your own family now, with your own traditions. While we may not always understand or immediately embrace your choices, we respect that they are yours to make." Richard looked genuinely surprised, while Allison's expression reflected cautious hope. "So I propose a toast," Mr. Henderson concluded, "to honoring the past while embracing the future, to finding new ways to be family together." A chorus of "Hear, hear" rose from around the table as glasses were raised. Even Mrs. Henderson, after a moment's hesitation and a pointed look from her husband, lifted her glass in grudging participation. As the meal continued, I noticed a subtle shift in the atmosphere. The conversation flowed more naturally, with moments of genuine connection between members of both families. Mrs. Henderson remained somewhat reserved, but she was at least engaging politely with Allison's grandmother seated beside her. Richard caught my eye across the room and gave me a small smile of relief. Whatever clearing the air the Henderson parents had planned, it had taken a more constructive direction than anticipated. Whether this represented a genuine shift in their thinking or merely a strategic retreat remained to be seen, but for the moment, the holiday peace was preserved. I was directing the servers preparing to bring out dessert when Victoria Henderson appeared at my elbow. "I need to speak with you," she said in a low voice. "Privately." Curious but wary, I led her to a small alcove off the main dining room. "Is there a problem with the service?" I asked. Victoria glanced back toward the dining room before responding. "I want to book the manor for my daughter's Sweet 16 in February." The request caught me completely off guard. "I see. We do host birthday celebrations, of course." "This isn't about the birthday," she said impatiently. "This is about—" She hesitated, seeming to struggle with her next words. "About acknowledging that perhaps you run a better operation than I initially gave you credit for." Coming from a Henderson, this was tantamount to effusive praise. "Charlotte's 16th is important," she continued. "I want it to be perfect, and watching how you've handled today, maintaining boundaries while still creating a warm atmosphere, I realized you might actually be the right person for the job." "Thank you," I said, genuinely surprised by the compliment. "I'd be happy to discuss hosting Charlotte's birthday." "Good," she nodded briskly. "But let's be clear. My mother doesn't need to know I specifically requested your venue. As far as she's concerned, this was Charlotte's choice." I suppressed a smile. "Of course, family dynamics can be complicated." "You have no idea," Victoria muttered, before straightening her shoulders and returning to her professional demeanor. "I'll have my assistant call next week to schedule a proper consultation." As she walked away, I realized that perhaps Mr. Henderson's toast had reflected more family members' changing perspectives than just his own. The shift might be gradual and grudging, but it was happening nonetheless. Dessert was served without incident. Pumpkin and pecan pies with fresh whipped cream, alongside coffee and after-dinner drinks. As the meal wound down, guests broke into smaller conversation groups, some returning to the comfortable seating area near the fireplace. The Mitchell and Henderson cousins seemed to be bonding over shared professional interests, while Allison's brother was engaged in an animated conversation with Blake Henderson about a recent sporting event. Richard and Allison circulated together, spending time with each group and clearly enjoying their role as hosts. Even Mrs. Henderson had relaxed somewhat, though she still maintained a certain rigidity in her posture that suggested she hadn't fully embraced the new family dynamic. As the afternoon stretched into early evening, I checked in with Richard and Allison discreetly. "Everything has been perfect, Emma," Allison assured me. "Far better than I dared hope." "My father's toast surprised me," Richard admitted. "I think he's genuinely trying, even if mother is still struggling with the concept of not being in control. Baby steps? Allison said with a gentle smile. Rome wasn't built in a day, and neither are healthy family boundaries. Well, Hawthorne Manor is at your disposal for as many family gatherings as you need while those boundaries are established, I told them. And I should mention that your sister Victoria has expressed interest in hosting her daughter's birthday. Here, Richard's eyebrows shot up in surprise. Victoria? The same Victoria who declared your venue charmingly rustic but obviously budget-conscious at our wedding? The very same, I confirmed with a smile. People can surprise you. Apparently, he agreed, looking across the room to where his sister was now chatting comfortably with Allison's mother. Maybe there's hope for my family yet. As the Henderson and Mitchell families gathered their belongings and prepared to depart, I stood near the entrance to bid them farewell. One by one, they thanked me for the beautiful setting and exceptional service. Even Mrs. Henderson managed, a stiff nod that, from her, constituted high praise. Richard and Allison were the last to leave, lingering to express their gratitude. You've done more than host a meal, Emma, Allison said, clasping my hand warmly. You've helped us establish a precedent for how our families will interact going forward. I'm glad I could help, I replied sincerely. That's really what Hawthorne Manor is all about, creating spaces where meaningful moments can happen, even difficult ones. Well, you've gained clients for life, Richard assured me, though hopefully future events will involve less family drama. The Henderson Christmas is just a month away, I reminded him with a smile. But I suspect it will be smoother sailing after today's success. After they departed, I walked through the now quiet manor, reflecting on the journey that had led me here. From being insulted at the altar by a family who thought I was beneath them, to becoming their reluctant but necessary neutral ground. It was an unexpected path, but a satisfying one. My phone chimed with a text from Victoria Henderson's assistant, already requesting that consultation for Charlotte's Suite 16. The message ended with a note that they'd need my highest level of discretion regarding the venue selection process. I laughed, shaking my head at the ongoing Henderson family dynamics. Some things changed slowly, if at all. Standing in my beautifully restored manor as twilight fell, I felt a deep sense of vindication. Mrs. Henderson would probably never fully acknowledge that my venue was worthy of her family's events, but her actions, returning here again and again, however reluctantly, spoke volumes more than her words ever could. The Hendersons had insulted me at the altar, dismissed my venue as inadequate, and threatened my livelihood, unaware that I owned the very ground beneath their designer shoes. Now they were booking multiple events, inadvertently securing my business's success, while I quietly enforced boundaries they couldn't cross. Sometimes revenge isn't about dramatic confrontations or burning bridges. Sometimes it's simply about standing your ground, knowing your worth, and watching as those who underestimated you are forced to acknowledge, even if never out loud, that they were wrong. If you've enjoyed this story about standing up to entitled Behavior and Finding Sweet Professional Revenge, make sure to hit the subscribe button below. I share new stories each week about moments of justice, empowerment, and the satisfaction of proving doubters wrong. Your subscription means everything to this channel, and I promise the next story will be just as satisfying as watching the mighty Hendersons gradually bend to the will of the venue coordinator they once dismissed. Don't forget to drop a comment sharing your own experiences with people who underestimated you. I read every single one.